Good morning. Welcome everyone to this Waterfront webinar on what does the introduction of environmental outcomes reports mean for your development, EORs. My name's Rufus Howard. I'm the ICEP policy lead for impact assessment and a long-time impact assessment practitioner. I'm going to be facilitating and hosting today. I'm delighted to have three highly qualified speakers. We have Katie Abrahams, for a senior associate from CMS, Pete Davis, technical director at WSP, and Jessamy Funnell, technical director, impact assessment at AECOM. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a short sort of 10-minute view from each of our speakers, and then we're going to have a group Q&A, which I will facilitate. There is a Q&A function or chat box. So as we go through, something occurs to you, please chuck it in the Q&A and we'll pick it up at the end. We'll have all three speakers and then the Q&A, but please put the questions in throughout. A very quick word from me. EORs been talked about for a while. I won't go into the history because that'll be covered by our speakers, but they're very topical. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion. And yeah, let's get straight into it. So our first speaker, and I'll invite up Jessamy.
Great, thank you, Rufus. Sorry, Maxine, can I? Oh, you got the slides coming up. Great, thank you. Great, so morning, everyone. My name's Jessamy. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this webinar. As Rufus mentioned, I'm a technical director at AECOM in the impact assessment team based in London. My main role is directing and coordinating EIAs, and I've been doing this for just over 20 years. I'm also aware of the scale of the changes which we're anticipating as part of the environmental outcomes reports, and that this will affect people at all levels of the decision making and preparation. So just as a warm-up really, I wanted to talk a little bit about where environmental outcomes reports have come from. So the origin dates back to mid-2022, which is preparation of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. In March 2023, the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, DLUC, held a consultation on environmental outcomes reports. And this invited feedback on the existing EIA process from industry and decision makers, including ways in which the process could be improved, elements that are working well, and also views on switching to an outcomes-based approach. This consultation ran from March to June 2023. In October 2023, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act received royal assent, and this contains powers for a new framework for environmental assessment. Little was heard until March this year, when the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, published environmental outcomes reports, roadmap to reform, and alongside this, a response to the consultation feedback. Following publication of this roadmap, we have a slightly better understanding of the direction of travel towards EORs. However, we're currently in a holding pattern whilst we await release of the draft regulations and draft guidance for consultation, and also importantly, publication of nationally agreed outcomes against which the environmental performance of projects will be measured. Next slide, please, Maxine. So I'd like to just talk very briefly about a couple of changes that we can expect. The first one being scoping. So currently, as many of you will be aware, we have an opportunity to consult with the local planning authority and statutory bodies at an early stage to agree the scope of an EIA. This is achieved by setting out key environmental effects to be assessed and the associated methodology, and also agreeing topics to be scoped out. This scoping report is then used to obtain a scoping opinion from the local planning authority or the relevant EIA decision maker. However, this is expected to change with environmental outcomes reports. The 2023 consultation indicated that scoping was likely to be replaced by a summary report setting out the findings of a desk-based scoping study, but without the opportunity to undertake formal consultation to agree the scope of the assessment. The summary scoping report was proposed to be submitted alongside the environmental outcomes reports to demonstrate that potential effects are being considered and, where applicable, ruled out. Following concerns raised during consultation, the roadmap now includes a key theme as scoping, and this will be part of the structures and procedures that the government will be developing to implement environmental outcomes reports. Other key themes include screening, decision-making, monitoring, and enforcement. Which brings me on to my second point, mitigation. So the mitigation hierarchy, which many of you will be aware of, i.e. avoidance of impacts as a priority, mitigation if avoidance isn't possible, and finding compensation as a last resort. So this mitigation hierarchy is in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. And the Secretary of State has powers to introduce a more robust approach for how mitigation is considered. In response to the 2023 consultation and concerns raised over ineffective mitigation in the current system, environmental outcomes reports are expected to strengthen mitigation and monitoring. Post-implementation monitoring is anticipated, which will ensure that projects deliver the level of environmental protection committed to in their environmental outcomes reports, and to monitor the efficacy of the mitigation measures. It's not clear exactly how the monitoring and mitigation is to be strengthened in practice through the EOR regime, nor the consequences of failed mitigation. However, use of standardized data and data sharing will be invaluable to compare predicted and actual environmental impacts. Monitoring will provide opportunity for a feedback loop, and this will result in benefits such as improved transparency and reduced subjectivity in assessments. Associated resources and capacity building will be required, including by local planning authorities and statutory consultees. At present, we can only speculate as to the detail of the draft regulations and guidance. Many feel that the current system that we have leads to environmental assessments being unwieldy and difficult for the public to understand. One of the key opportunities of environmental outcomes reports is to reset the landscape and return to the fundamentals of environmental assessment. I, for one, very much look forward to publication of further information ahead of environmental outcomes reports being introduced in December next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessamy. We will now pass on to Pete, and we'll have Pete's sort of opening remarks. Fire in those questions that any thoughts you're having from Jessamy or Pete's presentation.
Thanks, Rufus. Hopefully, Max, you can put up the slides. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to present and join this dialogue. It's probably fair to reflect the fact that my entire working career has been related to either the study of or application of assessment work, particularly SEAs. I think it's tracked the anticipation implementation when I studied my master's many years ago, all the way through to the subsequent directive, and then its implementation through UK regs in 2004. And so I've read quite a lot of the background and dialogue and exchanges in terms of, particularly on sustainability appraisals and SEAs, the extended commentaries to the effect of these are lengthy bureaucratic documents that add little value to decision making. And yeah, I always feel pained when I read that, but with a polite smile. But I do recognise the appetite for change. And certainly the solution proposed by government here in terms of environmental outcome reports, they are a response to that challenge. And as recognised in the Office of Environmental Protection submission as part of the EOR consultation, there was an acknowledgement that there are issues about the complexity of the reports, the difficulties for people to understand what is said, the problems of engagement, the ability to access and understand information to inform decision making. The response then by the government reflected in Levelling Up and Regeneration Act was in Part 6 to propose environmental outcome. The intention there, as stated by the government's response in terms of the roadmap, is that it will allow communities to better understand the environmental effects of development. It gives developers certainty, and it provides decision makers with the information they need. I think in terms of the last point, there is text to the effect that rather than repeating at length technical reports, it's about highlighting and flagging specific key pieces of information within the EORs. However, at this present point, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to provide clarity. The roadmap states that EORs will be implemented by the end of 2027. To achieve that, regulations need to be passed that specify what the environmental outcomes are that we're seeking to assess against. They need to establish the processes of assessment and provide clarity about the reporting requirements. One of the particular, I think, relevant points about EORs in terms of assessment is that they're proposing to use a series of national and project level indicators to assess the contributions towards achievement of outcome. At this point, whilst there are some indicators at that national level, there isn't the companion piece at the project level, let alone are they aligned with the outcomes yet to be adopted. In addition to that, and as recognised as part of the government's consultations, there's a range of supporting material in terms of reporting templates, guidance, capacity building that is needed at this point to facilitate the change towards the new assessment and reporting regimes. There's also an acknowledgement that in that change, there needs to be a transition period. We can't really go to the end of 2027 and then from that point, from the 1st of Jan 2028, assume that this thing applies to all future projects and plans. There needs to be an accommodation. And we saw that previously in terms of the adoption of the SEA regs in 2024 and an allowance for certain periods of time about plans that were in progress. Do they have to have assessment or not? Next slide, Maxine. So what are the requirements? In terms of Part 6 of the Act and sections 152, 153, they set out quite explicitly the opportunity in terms of to establish the regulations, which will require that EORs are completed for plans and projects. It's that within that, the activities that underpin and could be related to projects are defined. They are quite extensive, but they are distinct and different from the thresholds that many of you will recognise in terms of the schedules that underpin EIA and to some extent reflect material that underpins the SEA. In terms of what the purpose of EIR is to assess the contribution of the plan or project to the delivery of specified outcomes. It also makes reference to the codified mitigation hierarchy and also requires the consideration of reasonable alternatives. I think for many of us that have gone through the process with SEA, that's a reference that we can all recognise, and its importance within decision making is particularly important. proposed, ultimately monitoring measures are required to be proposed, but those should link back to the indicators and they should permit evaluation. Ultimately, EOR and its implementation is important to project consent and plan adoption. And the contingencies within it are that those 2 points are dependent upon the completion of an EOR. But then reference is made to the fact that EORs must be taken into account within decision making, but then doesn't qualify what that practically means. There's then a range of opportunities in terms of further specification, in terms of the circumstances under which assessment could be required, how it's undertaken, the information that's included in reports, and how decision making is given effect. So in terms of what's missing, or what in terms of reflections could change, the assessment regime at this point applies to England, although it's stated it's UK-wide. And it permits that the devolved administrations could implement it as well. But it could lead then to differences in approaches between Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, and Wales. How does that affect then projects or plans that cross boundaries? I'm afraid at this point, it is silent. There isn't any information that establishes at this point in a way that the SEA regs, which are the qualifying sectors, which plan authors are affected. Similarly for projects, there's no qualifying project thresholds. It's purely based on a limited number of activities. The reference to programs is dropped. Similarly, for those relate to Scotland, for the SEA regs, there's no reference to strategy either. It says that outcomes are being considered, but as we'll come on to the next slide, no guidance as to what that means in terms of what are the environmental outcomes to be considered. I think as Jessamy's mentioned, the scoping stage, at least within legislation, is not present. Similarly, there's nothing that specifies, as they do in terms of the relevant regulations, what the reporting requirements are, what is the information that's needed to be presented. And the one that I find quite perplexing at the moment is there's no actual commitment to consult in a way that there necessarily is that underpins both EIA and SEA. Next slide, please, Maxine. So what are environmental outcomes? The Act itself is silent. It doesn't define them. It clearly provides the opportunity to specify those outcomes and devolves that to the relevant authorities, which I think in the guidance is Secretary of State. Treasury Group does define what an outcome is, pithily as the result of change. But I think in terms of clarifying what an outcome is important. And I think I proposed in that fourth bullet point that it could be specific, measurable, a desired positive change to the environment. But it still requires some articulation of what that is. And they really have to be enduring. They have to be something that we have confidence in that will cover more than a decade. So that in terms of our development work, our consenting work, we have confidence that these will not change. They will not be subject to political whim. And there is something distinct about an outcome as opposed to references to goals, objectives, and targets. At this point, both in terms of the consultation and then subsequently, there's strong reference to outcomes being a reinterpretation of the targets and goals in the Environment Improvement Plan. But that's not clear. And there should be working undertaken at this point to progress an understanding of that ultimately underpins what published in terms of the regulation. There's an example of the outcome in the government consultation 2023. And I think it shows you the gap at this point, as highlighted in OOP, that the evidence is needed. Next slide, please, Maxine. One of the other reflections at this point is that there's a narrowing of scope. So the 2023 consultation listed a limited number of environmental protection topics that could be included in EOR. If you reflect on that, compared even to the EOP goals and targets, but particularly compared to the scopes of the EIA or SEA topics, there's a narrowing. There's an absence of population, an absence of human health, an absence of material assets, an absence of reference to climate change. And certainly the argument put forward within the government work is that that's in regard to the fact that they're trying to avoid duplication. I think, and when you compare it to state appraisal, there's no reference really to the broader socioeconomic considerations. And ultimately, even if those topics are retained in a limited set, there is a variability to the source data and the indicators that are used for the national project level. Last slide, please, Maxine. There's a summary of what some of the key differences are at this point. And this is a table that was adapted from a publication from IES in terms of their response to the 2026 consultation roadmap findings. And really, it's just showing you what the differences are. And at this point, in terms of the process, there's clearly a shift away, at least at this point, from screening and scoping towards assessment and towards mitigation and monitoring. There's an ambition that things is expedited relative to the current timeframes. And that's achieved through a more proportionate approach to assessment, with a focus on a high-level consideration of outcomes with reference to mitigation. I think inevitably, if you've worked through this process as long as I and perhaps other colleagues have, that ambition for speed is recognised. But in practice, without the supporting tools, without clarity on the outcomes and the processes applied, it remains an ambition at this point. And similar to Jessamy, yeah, I look forward to seeing the next steps. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Pete. That's great. Well, that's certainly triggered questions for me. And actually, we have a few questions now flooding in. So keep the questions coming. And I'd like to welcome Katie up as our third and final speaker.
Hi, good morning all. I'll wait until my slides appear. Thank you, Maxine. You can go on to the next slide. So my name's Katie Abrahams. I'm a senior associate in the planning team in London at CMS. So I am a planning lawyer and I help to consent large-scale energy and infrastructure projects. Moving on to the next slide. I think we've touched on this already with the previous speakers, but just in high level, EORs are set to replace the EIA regs under the Town and Country Planning Act and the DCO regimes and also SEA. And as we've heard, the aim is to move away from what we are told is a process-driven assessment to a more outcome-focused approach. So rather than predicting what might happen to the environment as a result of a proposed development, EORs will measure what's actually happened to the environment as a consequence of certain actions, and they're expected to replace the current regimes by the end of next year. Moving on to the next slide, I won't focus on what's happened today because Jessamy covered this beautifully earlier, but I thought it might help to just explain a little bit more the mischief that the government is trying to address through the implementation of EORs. So the OEP's review they conducted of the implementation of EIA and SEA identified a number of what they consider to be fundamental root causes undermining the effectiveness of those regimes, appreciating Pete's comments about that. And there's a couple that were mentioned, which is access to information. The OEP found that environmental data was difficult to find and not readily available for reuse. And it recommended publishing a plan to improve data accessibility and creating a map-based online portal to signpost users to national and regional databases. And the government responded by committing to clarify data use and to mandate data standards for certain environmental data sets under the new EOR regime. Another point that was raised was post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting. The OEP identified weaknesses in how outcomes were tracked after decisions had been taken. The government also identified issues in their March 2023 consultation of 3 years ago in respect to the existing regime that they considered necessitating reform. So they considered that the current regime is inefficient, that they found that assessment isn't carried out early enough in the development process and isn't focused on clearly defined relevant priorities. They also considered there to be duplication and overly long reports, inhibiting transparency and adding delay. There's a view that there's risk aversion, so fear of legal challenge has led to assessments becoming repetitive and overly cumbersome. Potential loss of focus was considered, and also, again, the point around data. So the government considers that EORs will address these concerns by replacing the EIA and SEA regimes with a clearer, simpler outcomes-based approach. And under this approach, plans and projects will be assessed against tangible environmental outcomes, as we've heard. So moving on to the next slide, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023 gives the Secretary of State numerous powers. So to set environmental outcomes, as we've heard, to publish guidance, to streamline the process, to introduce a more robust approach post-decision for monitoring mitigation, to standardise data, and to ensure alignment. Moving on to the next slide, the government published in March of earlier this year this roadmap to reform about the next phases. So what are we to expect? Well, we're told that phase 1 will focus on setting environmental outcomes, which, as we've heard, we look forward to seeing, and a guidance as to how they're to be met. It's important to flag that the regime includes a non-regression safeguard to ensure no reduction in environmental protection, and there's this emphasis on focus and proportionality. Phase 2 moves to drafting and consulting on the regs that underpin how EORs will actually operate in practice, so it does exactly what it says on the tin. And phase 3, I think, will be key. It's when the secondary legislation will be laid, followed by testing and rollout of the regime. And we've heard there'll be this phase transition, including potentially the dual running of the existing and the new regimes. Obviously, the current EIA and SEA regimes continue to apply until the EORs are implemented. But what I thought was interesting is that of the 278 responses received to the consultation, 82% of those support a 2-year transition period with the two regimes running alongside each other, which I think would be helpful. On to the next slide. So how do EORs differ from EIAs? I think the starting point is that they're designed to respond directly to the limitations of the current regime that the government have considered, that I ran through a minute ago. The key difference is one of focus. So EIAs focus on predicting impacts and EORs focus on measuring and delivering outcomes. So rather than asking whether every potential impact has been assessed through the correct procedural steps, EORs ask a more direct question, which is, does the plan or project support the delivery of specified environmental outcomes, and are those outcomes actually achieved over time? This outcomes-based approach changes the nature of the environmental assessment, and the idea is that rather than have these considered to be lengthy assessments, EORs are designed to provide clarity on whether development contributes positively to the defined environmental goals. These outcomes may refer to biodiversity, air and water quality, carbon emissions, land use, waste generation, and other ecological indicators. On to the next slide, please. So that shift from EIAs to EORs has several consequences. First, it improves transparency and accessibility by streamlining assessment around outcomes. EORs aims to make environmental information clearer and easier to understand for stakeholders. And this is considered to directly address the problem under the EIA regs where the scale and complexity can undermine meaningful engagement. Secondly, EORs support more evidence-based decision-making. Instead of assessing impacts in isolation, decision-makers are asked to consider whether developments align with clearly defined outcomes. This allows for more consistent and comparable assessments across projects. EORs also introduce a genuine feedback loop into environmental decision-making. Under EIAs, the bulk of assessment takes place before the consent is granted, even though the real-world effects of the development are often uncertain at that stage. And EORs recognise the uncertainty and place greater emphasis on monitoring and reporting after the permission is granted, so that outcomes can be tracked, lessons learnt, and mitigation strengthened where necessary. There's also to be alignment with national environmental priorities. Under the EIA regime, assessments tend to focus on project-specific impacts on individual environmental receptors, but EORs, by contrast, are intended to operate within wider environmental policy frameworks, including climate targets and nature recovery objectives. And development will be assessed on how it contributes to these strategic goals, rather than on purely the adverse impacts and whether they can be mitigated. Government also intends EORs to be more proportionate and a more efficient system. So by simplifying screening and scoping, improving standardisation and reducing duplication, the EOR framework aims to shorten assessment timescales and reduce reporting burdens. And it's intended to support faster planning decisions without weakening environmental protections. EORs are also expected to strengthen mitigation, and the reforms explicitly consider how mitigation and long-term monitoring can be designed to deliver real benefits for nature while recognising the practical burdens that this can place on local authorities. And the intention is to focus resources where they deliver the greatest environmental benefits rather than producing ever more detailed assessments. On to the next slide. I'll skip over this because Pete has already covered this in a very similar form. So on to what can project promoters do at the moment in light of all of this change that's coming at us, we are told. So the starting point is that we are still operating under the existing regimes, and so it's very much business as usual for now. But for projects thinking of submitting applications towards the end of next year and beyond, there are a few things that could be done and considered to future-proof a peer or initial environmental assessment and the ES. And what I say obviously comes against a backdrop of there hopefully being adequate transition provisions. Obviously, the first point, very obviously, is that we should all be monitoring the forthcoming consultation on the EOR regs and the guidance and outcomes, because obviously the devil will be in the detail. I think we can focus on what is not changing. So it's important to remember that actually much of the technical foundation isn't actually being swept away. So the requirement for technical assessments, including early consideration of reasonable alternatives, remains unchanged. So promoters can continue to invest in high quality technical assessment and early stage environmental thinking that informs project design, because that will transfer directly into the EOR framework. Frame environmental work around delivering outcomes where possible, appreciating that's still very uncertain at the moment, given that's the focus of EORs. So promoters could start framing environmental work around measurable improvements and alignment with national priorities such as climate, nature recovery, water quality. So practically sort of linking mitigation and enhancement to tangible environmental gains, explaining how schemes contribute to wider environmental objectives, even where that goes beyond legal minimums, treating enhancement measures as core project components. On to the next slide, please. Another point is to strengthen monitoring and delivery arrangements. As we've been hearing, EORs are expected to place much greater emphasis on the post-permission delivery and monitoring. So to prepare for that, we could be designing monitoring frameworks early with clear triggers and responsibilities and reporting routes, ensuring Section 106s and DCO requirements are capable of securing long-term outcomes, not just construction phase mitigation, aligning environmental commitments with other regimes like BNG and EDPs. Also investing in proportionate but high quality data, baseline data. The roadmap signals a move towards this standardized and transparent data, so that, including greater use of open data. So we could be focusing on collecting data that genuinely supports the outcome testing and using robust, repeatable methodologies so that outcomes can be measured over time. And the last point is using scoping at this point of the EIA process to manage this transition risk. So lock down topics, anticipate a narrow, more focused EOR scope, and engaging obviously early with stakeholders in respect of what we are doing, and that can help to reduce risk. So that's the extent of my presentation. Over to Rufus.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Pete and Jessamy. We've got a whole bunch of questions coming in. I think we've got 15, 16. So let's get into it. I've already seen, I've had a quick scan through them. There's multiple comments on some themes such as indicators, legal risks, legal challenges, etc. So I'll maybe bunch a few that are on the same topic. So we'll start at the beginning. First question is around, can we provide an example of a project level indicator? I think Pete flashed up one from the consultation. The question here is, thinking of topics such as landscape and visual assessment, where professional judgment is often required and where the level of effect is not simply binary assessment outcome. So shall we have a quick chat about example level indicators and whether it lends itself better to some topics rather than others?
So in terms of the indicators that are proposed, there's the national set of indicators in terms of the DEFRA environmental indicator framework. And so we've been directed so far in terms of the consultation and the consultation responses towards that, and certainly OAP referenced that as a starting point, but they note at a national level that itself is still incomplete. And then as the attendees then commented, but then there's a series of project level indicators that still need to be established that also demonstrate reference points towards an achievement outcome. So in terms then of establishing an outcome-based indicator for landscape and visual assessment, you've got to start with what is the outcome. And unfortunately, we still are unclear on what that would be. And then in terms of, then what is the national indicators for that? And then the project contribution. And it still comes back to understanding specifically what the nature of the assessment is in terms of, is it, as I suggested, assessing a contribution towards the outcome? Or is it about whether the proposed plan or project supports achievement of the outcome? And they are subtly different. So it does make it, and apologies, it's a long way of saying I think the question is brilliant, but it is phenomenally difficult to provide an example at this point, at least from my personal perspective, that will address, I think, adequately the underlying concern, and gives confidence, because until we have the outcomes, I think it's premature. That's a personal perspective, but please, colleagues, Jessamy, please.
Katie, Jessamy, do you want to comment at all on the indicator and difficulties raised by Pete and the question?
Yeah, no, certainly concur with Pete's sort of summary just there. Yeah, I think it's really hard at this stage because we don't know what we're trying to demonstrate compliance against, and there are definitely shades of grey in the current assessment process. And obviously the question refers to landscape and visual assessment, cultural heritage being another technical area where the current practice has evolved very much through good practice and making reference to government policy, so trying to be specific in terms of the contribution of an individual project in the same way as, for instance, air quality or noise is inherent with difficulties for certain topics.
Yeah, thank you. Katie, any comments on indicators specifically?
I don't have anything to add to what's been raised already, thank you.
A couple of thoughts from myself if we draw on existing practice. For example, when we look at climate change under existing EIA, one of the problems with doing quantification of GHGs is after you've quantified them, then what? What are you comparing them against? What is the outcome? Is the outcome net zero? Is it a transition towards a 1.5 compliant, transition pathway? And this is what we set out in our guidance. But what we found in practice was that people will often say, well, our project will contribute X tons of carbon, but that is 0.0001% of the UK's total carbon, and therefore it's a non-issue. So if we took that approach to all of the other topics, you could think of saying, well, okay, project's going to have a negative effect on this specific species or some individuals of this specific species, but is the total outcome for that species its population level survival, or is it absolute protection on all individuals? Depending on what the answer to that outcome is, depends, I'll tell you what the indicator is. And if we go back to the landscape question, if the landscape outcome was the protection or the maintenance of a landscape against its landscape character area, or in some sort of national park against the protected characteristics of that landscape, you can see I'm not an LVIA practitioner, but the point is, if there's some sort of outcome about a maintenance of the landscape special features or protected characteristics, then the project would be, what, to use Pete's language, what would be the project's contribution to achieving or hindering the achievement of that outcome, of that protected landscape. And ultimately, from my perspective, I can't see how that takes us back to what we're already doing, which is professional judgment about the effects of the project against certain criteria. So the question mark for me around the indicators is that on some levels, without the outcomes, we can't design the indicators. Second levels, depending if it's a national outcome, you might not be able to differentiate the indicator. And we get into questions of attribution, which we probably need a whole hour to talk about attribution, but how do you know that your project is leading to that outcome as opposed to other wider non-project effects? So it's actually fiendishly complex. And I think when you sort of workshop through an individual topic, I find that inevitably I end up coming back to what we already do. And why do we do it the way we do it? Because we've been doing it since 1985, and we've kind of honed it to perfection as to this is the sensible and practical way of assessing this impact. So I would be surprised if we suddenly come up with something we haven't thought of, despite spending 35 years plus arguing about it and studying it. But that's just my view. Let's move on and get some more questions. The second or the third question is really focused around the government contending with everything it's got on its plate. And there's a few questions on this. So the gist of the first question is, given everything the government has to contend with at the moment, what are the panel's members' views on ministers actually getting EOR regime rights upon implementation and the likelihood of them publishing quality, proportionate and generally helpful guidance for impact assessment practitioners and developers? Just hold that thought, because they're talking there about getting it done in time, but also not just getting the legislation in place, but all that accompanying guidance and training, capacity building that was mentioned by Pete and was also in the consultations. And there's some further down on the same. What is the view of the panel members as to how much work, i.e. 10%, 90%, the government still has to do on these regulations to get them out in time and avoid the no regression on so that's a question more about the roadmap and whether that time allows it to achieve something that would not that would meet the non-regression clause. So I'll stop there because that's two meaty ones. So thoughts around, I guess, deliverability and time span and quality.
I think it's quite ambitious. If we are to hit the end of next year deadline, I think we would be expecting the consultation to be published imminently. it's anyone's guess as to how progressed government is with the outcomes and the work on the regs and the guidance. I entirely agree that we need to see all that. As I said, the devil's in the detail, and we do need really clear guidance on how this is going to work. And I think also crucially for the industry, what would be really useful to understand is the transitional provisions and what that looks like, because these big DCO NSIP projects are years and years in the making, and there are many developers who are thinking about submitting end of next year, the year after, and need some more information and clarity and guidance on the approach that is coming at us, if it is coming at us. And so I would obviously encourage government to press ahead with publishing and consulting on what it can as soon as possible. I'll hand over to my panels to add to that.
Yeah, I think I'm building on that, Katie. I would totally concur. I think the time frame is too challenging, if I was honest. I think looking at the material that's currently, at least in the public domain, looking at the areas that are still to be resolved, and considering evidence such as that provided by the OEP, there's still much that still requires further thought. One of the things that I think is quite interesting, at least in terms of the government's proposed approach, is one of the genuine attempt for co-collaboration and so co-development. So they are seeking participants. So we all have an opportunity to participate in this process. So I do think the timeframes perhaps are too ambitious and will extend out. We all have an opportunity to participate in their development to ensure they get things right. So I suppose in terms of Josh's comment, I'd put it closer to 90% than 10%, Josh, in terms of work still to be done. And there needs to be greater coherence across the different elements. I think there was one very revealing comment I always remember from the OEP evidence. They talked about the fact that there's 191 countries have some sort of environmental assessment regime. Only 2 have reference to outcomes. It's New Zealand and Holland. And that they would expect, or they had expected back in 2023, that those would be primary sources of further research to support what's needed. The fact that we have so many questions still yet to be resolved suggests, there's a scale still to progress. And then I think more time is needed to ensure that the new regime is the right one. I think we can all acknowledge the ambition and the need for improvement, but to realize those ambitions and those objectives will take time, care, thought, and evidence. But we all have a role in supporting that.
Thank you, Pete. Jessamy, would you like to comment?
I think Pete's put that very, very succinctly and very well. But I think my main thoughts are that we need to do our best to try and influence the guidance, in particular, and the idea of templates. I know the roadmap mentions about pilot projects as well, and I think perhaps a number of organisations and representatives on this call have signed up for those. So I think that's really an area where we need to try and participate and step up and try and shape this sort of going forward as best we can with the opportunities which are given to us.
Thank you, Jessamy. In terms of deliverability, from my perspective, having been a consultant for 22 years and worked on numerous projects of this nature and others, I think it's highly unlikely that this is achievable by the end of 2027. If we just think about it logically for a moment, you have to design the outcomes, agree the outcomes, develop indicators for those outcomes, then write guidance on how to apply the assessment of those outcomes, then test them, pilot them, then complete the pilot, and then think about the changes you need to make on the basis of that pilot, and then put that into legislation, consult on that, pass it, implement it in 18 months. given that it took 3 years to just respond to the consultation, I just think it's massively unrealistic just in the real world. So if they do that in that time frame, the only logical way you could do that is if you pay lip service to the consultation. You basically say, this is what we've done, pretend you're consulting on, and then do it anyway. Like, you don't have that feedback loop. That's one way of shortening it. Or you rush, all of those steps. And the danger of rushing those steps is that it's, the implication of EORs will apply to all of our major strategies and all of our major projects for decades to come. It's, of massive importance to the environment and the economy in this country, and it's not something we should be rushing out. It should be done, I think, as Pete said, carefully, properly, and evidence-based. And I'm all for the ambition of improving the process, but these things can't be rushed. They need to be done properly. And given the lack of progress as we stand today, I find it impossible, based on my experience, to believe that a world-class system that achieves every ambition that they've set out will be achieved and rolled out in 18 months. That's my view. In terms of next questions, there are questions about legal challenge. I mean, this is a good one for Katie to think about. We have jurisprudence and case law and precedents built up over not just the UK, but, from European case law. And one of the big drivers for the reforms was saying projects are getting delayed with legal challenges, etc. And a lot of people have said this, not just in our chat, but multiple times, that surely this opens up massive areas of new untested precedent and case law, and actually can have the opposite effect, certainly in the short term, and by short term, maybe 5 years, where people are challenging various elements of the system for the first time. So is that a genuine fear, Katie, or an unfounded fear?
No, I think I absolutely agree. I think it is a genuine fear. I think obviously with the existing regimes, we have a long established body of case law. And if we rip that all up and have a whole new system, obviously it does open up new areas of challenge. And so absolutely agree, it could add actually project risk and delay in the event that there are challenges. So yeah, 100% agree with the question.
Just for me, Pete, something you've found in your practice or you raised as a concern with your clients?
Well, we certainly saw it as the introduction of SEA, that the first 6-7 years, there were more detailed legal cases that set out and established what were required, and certainly some of the 2012 cases in particular have always then driven our approaches to treatment reasonable alternatives subsequently. So, and again, OEP's evidence as part of the consultation rules highlighted this, the introduction of a new, largely untested assessment regime without parallels or many parallels overseas suggests the opportunity for significant challenge. So, in addition to everything we touched on in terms of the ambition of the timeframes, the ambitious nature of the timeframes, it would suggest that either through that transition period or beyond, there will be further responses needed to the evolution of the assessment regime to accommodate these findings. Jess?
Yeah, I completely agree, Pete. From an EOA perspective, I suppose as practitioners, we're forever alive to emerging case law and trying to make sure that we're future-proofing our reports as we go along. And a lot of that is sort of driven through EOA practice as well. So we're trying to sort of cover off and preempt the potential for objections to come forward at submission. I think one of the comments mentioned about the Finch case, and I think that's a really good example of case law that we're currently sort of as an industry trying to make sure that we're plugging any gaps in our current assessments to avoid that being raised as a legal objection. So on a personal basis, I can see that the new environmental outcomes regime will really throw everything up in the air, I suppose, in a basic way, but also give scheme objectors a huge opportunity to sort of criticise and undermine assessments as well. I think, yeah, it really will change the landscape in that respect.
Thank you, Jessamine. We've got a few comments that really tie back to me to capacity. So we've got questions about, who's going to undertake the monitoring and the enforcement, given the lack of monitoring and enforcement already happening is because the LPAs and statutory bodies don't have the manpower and the resources to carry out their functions. The EORs does not increase their budgets or change any of that. So how does that, how will the ambition of better monitoring and enforcement, something that ICEP has called for many years, but both ICEP and the OEP identified that the failure of monitoring and enforcement is not the legislation, it's the actual implementation, and that's the budget of those authorities with those duties. And therefore, how is EORs delivering the better monitoring and mitigation without addressing those capacity issues? And that also links to the question about better data. The ambition in EORs is we'll make much better use of data, and through clever use of data, we can do less baseline assessment, etc. But again, the ICEP reporting and the OEP reporting says the problems around data are a lack of data being collected, which goes back to budget cuts, Environment Agency not doing the water monitoring they used to do, etc. So again, the issue there isn't that EIA says use bad data or gives bad instruction on use of data. The issue sits out with EIA, which is about the data available and the capacity of the organizations that gather and make that data available. So the question to the audience, or rather to the speakers here, coming on both monitoring and data, is that if the OEP and ICEP are correct and that it's a capacity issue, how does the EOR, as it's drafted and suggested, provide these solutions to those issues without actually addressing those capacity issues?
So as part of the consultation back in 2023, there was an acknowledgement by the then speakers from CRG, at least in some of the webinars I participated in, that there is a resource implication at the front end. So there was a commitment at that point, say, to support capacity building in terms of training and guidance in conjunction with the Planning and Advisory Service. So that was particularly targeted at the LPAs. I think certainly the reflections of this morning, and I'm sure many others are continuing made to the government, which is that in this transition to a new assessment regime as untested, further support in terms of additional long-term resources are required. So I think that's something that we should be looking for as part of any dialogue in terms of their development. I think there's probably, it wouldn't surprise me if there's a slight counter-argument, which is that in terms of the efficiencies that are expected to be achieved through the delivery of the new EOR regime, that, at least from another perspective, would suggest that would liberate up some time that could support the refocusing on the long-term monitoring against the agreed set of indicators. I clearly would treat that argument with some caution, but I can at least understand how it could be made.
Thank you, Pete. Katie, Jessamine, thoughts?
Yeah, I think from a general perspective, local authorities, as we know, sort of currently struggle under the existing regime and can really see a sort of problem arising in terms of the amount of data and information that they're having to both receive in terms of planning applications, but then also undertake in terms of monitoring and trying to trace the sort of actual performance of projects as well. And it's really unclear as to what role that the developers will have going forward. Once a scheme has been consented, there may be a situation where a developer sells on the land, and then how does that work in terms of follow-up and monitoring where does that responsibility lie, and how does the local authority keep track of that as well? So I think it's a really complex and multidimensional concern in terms of data, both data handling, data monitoring, management, etc., at all levels.
Thank you, Jessamy. Katie, capacity issues, will that be a barrier?
Yeah, so I echo what's been said. I think yes, in a nutshell, given the time, it is likely to be a barrier. I think again, this all needs to be carefully thought through and consulted on. And again, we need to see the detail of how this is intended to work and play out in the guidance and the regs. Yeah.
Well, we're just over, so bad timing by myself. But thank you everyone who's joined and listened. And sorry we didn't get through all the questions. There's a fantastic number of questions, but I'll try and capture them off Waterfront and certainly bring them into further discussions, EORs. There is a in-person EOR meeting happening in London for ICEP members, so do look that up if you'd like to get involved. Keep your eye out for future Waterfront conferences and ICEP events. Thank you, Jessamy. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Maxine, for organising. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.